Welcome. In this video, we're going to talk about sin and vice in early Christianity. Let me say a little bit about the general framework of this video. We're going to be looking at a number of basic ideas from early Christian ethics, but we're going to look at them in terms of how they impact this notion of sin. That is, Aristotle, Plato, others talked about vice, but early Christians were talking about sin. So we want to see, is there something new that this is bringing to the Greco-Roman world? Right. So to look at that question, we are going to first briefly summarize the timeline of interactions between Christianity and the Roman Empire. We will discuss some of the distinctive features that Christianity brought to the Greco-Roman world. We will ask whether there is a difference between sin and vice. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about the concept of moral law. So let's get a brief timeline. Around 63 BC, the Romans conquered Jerusalem, which was, of course, the capital of what we'll call Judea, and they conquered the other regions around it as well. In 33 AD, that's roughly the date of the crucifixion. Now, the Romans, starting at that point, fluctuate between almost tolerating and severely persecuting Christians. I don't think there was a time when it was actually officially, openly, completely tolerated, but the level of persecution varied from almost nothing to severe. Now, at 70 AD, the Romans destroy Jerusalem. And as I understand it, the Christians stay out of the conflict between the Jews and the Romans, which of course doesn't do much to improve relationships between Judaism and Christianity. Okay? Creates a lot of bad blood, which of course continues in many ways for a long time. Now, in 313 AD, Constantine the Great adopts Christianity and orders religious toleration, okay? A general religious toleration. In 391 AD, the Emperor Theodosius the Great makes Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire and particularly suppresses paganism in many ways. I'm not exactly sure what Theodosius' policy was on Judaism, but as time goes on, Jews definitely become second-class citizens at best in the Roman Empire. Now, this kind of arrangement lasts, especially in the Eastern Roman Empire, until 1453 AD. That's when Constantinople falls to the Ottoman Empire. Now, so that in one sense is the end of this interaction between the Roman Empire and Christianity with the fall of the Roman Empire. Although, actually, both the Ottomans and the Russian Tsars will claim in some ways to be the heirs to the Roman Empire. Right? So some people argue it doesn't really go away totally until World War I. So that's our basic timeline. Now, a red herring, which is a misleading idea or a misleading clue. There was no golden age before Constantine. Okay, or at least we should be very suspicious of any claims that there was a golden age of Christianity before Constantine, and then Constantine came in and brought together church and state, and it destroyed everything. Now, my view on this idea is the following. What people tend to do is look at what they don't like in later forms of Christianity, try to say that Christianity really means what they do like, and then look back to try to find some point in history where everything went wrong. So if you're a pacifist, then you're going to say, well, of course, yeah, Christianity makes all these accommodations with armies, but that's a later thing. Really, early Christianity didn't have that, and here's the point where everything went wrong. Or if you think Christianity is really anti-institutional, and it looks really institutional in later periods, well, you have to find a point where all of a sudden the pure anti-institutional Christianity became institutional, etc., etc. Right? And one popular date to fix the point where everything went wrong is when is the age of Constantine. Another date I've seen sometimes in a different context has to do with Ireland. Okay, so occasionally people will say, well, really, Celtic Christianity was all this stuff that I want it to be before the Latins came in, the bad Latins came in and pushed their practices on Celtic Christianity. Right? I think we need to look at all such claims with a skeptical eye. And of course, keep in mind, there was no time of perfect doctrinal agreement, and there was no time of a perfectly happy, contented pluralism about belief either. Okay. So, with that in mind, let's talk about some of the distinctive ethical features of early Christianity. Right. Now, the general point here is that there's an enormous break between ancient pagan understandings of ethics and modern ethics. And this break is in large measure due to the influence of Christianity. So if we want to understand the origins of modern ethics, then we have to understand this change. So, let's start with the concept of the dignity of man, which is, of course, something that's being brought in from Judaism. Early Christians insisted on a common origin for each and every human being. So the way this is told in the book of Genesis is that there were two first parents, right, given the name Adam and Eve, which is really man and woman. In certain respects, they insisted on the equality of each and every human being, regardless of gender. But they did also allow for hierarchy, including gendered hierarchies, at the same time. Okay, so how these two things are reconciled is a thing that gets worked out. And they also insisted that human beings were in some sense a family. That's why I phrased it as the dignity of man instead of the dignity of human beings, because I want to emphasize the collective idea. Human beings sounds like a bunch of discrete people, but it was stronger than that. It was the idea of humankind as a unity, right? Not just a type, but a real unity. Now, I want to emphasize something about this. This directly and radically challenges the class system of Roman society. It's important not to underestimate how shocking this was to respectable Roman opinion. So let me give a hypothetical example. This is one out of my imagination, but I think it fits the facts. So you have to imagine that you are a Roman noblewoman. Right? You are married to someone very wealthy. You're from a very, very old Roman family that can trace itself back to the early Roman Republic. And you're married to someone from a similar old family. You are at the top of the hierarchy. And one of your neighbors gets you to come to one of these secret meetings that these people called Christians are having. Right? And you get interested in this. Right? Maybe you even become what's called a catechumen, which is someone who's preparing to be baptized and to become Christian. Well, when you get to these meetings, there's a shock. You're told pretty early on, okay, you have to stay outside. We're going to talk to you a little bit about this, but you can't come in for the main part of the meeting. And walking right past you are your neighbor's slaves. Okay, maybe even some of your own slaves, which surprises you. Right? And you're basically told, nope, you haven't been prepared yet. You're not ready yet to be in these meetings, but your slaves are, or your neighbor's slaves are. And then later on, let's say you are, at some point, one of the slaves might come out and they'll say, this person who's been illumined is going to instruct you, right, in how you ought to live and all the things you don't know but should. Right? Perhaps even an extreme, I don't know if this would have happened, one of those, your neighbor's slaves might become your godmother, right, who's now going to be instructing you and telling you when you're doing things wrong. Right? And right, you're a neophyte, literally means newly illumined person after you're baptized, right? And this person might have some kind of authority over you. That is incredibly shocking, unbelievable, scandalous to a Roman noblewoman. It is an incredible leap for that to happen. So that's a direct challenge to the class system of Roman society, and a very strong one. And I can point out other aspects of this. There's lots of stories of women martyrs who were killed because they found out they were Christians, and they found out they were Christians because they refused to marry someone. Right? They told their fathers, "I'm not marrying the person you want me to marry because he's not Christian," or "I'm not going to get married at all because I want to devote myself entirely to Christ, and I don't want to be distracted by having a husband and family." That was totally unacceptable. You could be killed for that in Roman society. But Christian women did it, and some of them were then turned over to the authorities and executed. Okay. And notice the brave defiance here. The person basically saying, nope, to the father, I don't care if you have total legal authority over me. I'm not doing what you say. And if you kill me, that's fine. I'm going to go on to a better life, and I'll be happier that way. That is a shocking, really, that's an earthquake in Roman society. Now, another concept that's important is the fall, right? As in, not as in autumn, as in falling off of something. Let me give you the background story here. Here's how it's told in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, it says that God created one man and one woman, and they were sinless. Okay, they had no sins, they had no vices. And they were put in a garden, they had everything they needed, life was wonderful, but they were given basically one command. You can eat the fruit from any tree here in the garden, so you have plenty to eat, but there's two trees in the center, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You may not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and because of this, they were told they would die, right? They would eventually die, so they became mortal, and they were corrupted. Okay, so now they had a strong tendency towards behaving badly, towards sin. Now, drawing on this story, Christians taught that each person was made in the image of God, and at the same time, people were all strongly inclined to behave badly. Okay? So, made in the image of God, but that was severely damaged. And notice, along with this comes a strong strain of resistance to any claim of perfection by individuals or institutions. So claiming that you have or are about to achieve total perfection was looked on with extreme suspicion. There's also, along with this, the concept of providence. Despite all the claims about every human being's unworthiness, Christianity taught that still God directly, personally loves each and every individual. So according to Christianity, he chose to bring each person into existence. He cares about each person. He's personally directly offended when they did something wrong, and he's always ready to forgive them and help them to change. All they have to do is ask for it. They have to recognize that they need to be forgiven, ask God to forgive them, and ask for help to change, and he will. Now, the helping to change is a gradual process. But notice, God cares deeply about what people do, and he wants their lives to go well. That's different from, say, Aristotle, who was a monotheist, but he believed in a God that was an origin of all things, but a God that didn't care about the universe or about particular human beings. In addition, there was a strong concept of personal responsibility. Christianity taught that nobody was excused from high moral standards. It didn't matter their circumstances, it didn't matter their class, it didn't matter their level of intelligence. There were very high moral standards that everyone was expected to live up to. Now, it also left enormous room for forgiveness. Okay? So there was this very high moral standards that everyone was accountable to, but an expectation that nobody was going to perfectly live up to them. And it left enormous room for forgiveness, but this was conditional on taking personal responsibility for your actions. You had to admit, as many of the later prayers say, that you sinned by your own fault. And also, that leads us to the concept of the good life. Among other things, Christianity viewed suffering as redemptive. What do I mean by that? I mean primarily, in our context, that it made you better off. Forgiveness was seen as a gift that God gave because God was loving, right? Not because anyone could somehow deserve it by what they did. But there was a view that one of the ways you showed your regret for your sins and that you were really sorry for them was by willingly accepting suffering and seeing yourself as having deserved it. Along with this, there was an idea that whether or not you deserved that particular suffering, you were made better off by it. You were a better or stronger person, or you expressed your love for God in that way. particularly because Christians believed that God had become man and then suffered. So the highest ideal for Christians was Jesus Christ, who had suffered humiliation, torture, and execution. Now, along these lines, in Plato, Socrates and Glaucon debate whether a person could be happy under torture. Christians did not debate whether a person could be happy under extreme suffering. They demonstrated that it was possible. Right? So let me give you a scenario out of my own imagination, but pulling from some real events. As I understand it, Nero, on at least one occasion, had a party at which the lighting for the party was Christians turned into torches. Christians were put up on poles and lit on fire. So I like to imagine that two philosophers were sitting around discussing Plato and discussing whether or not a person could be happy under extreme suffering. Well, while they're having this debate, up above them is a bunch of Christians burning to death and singing songs and expressing their gratitude for God for everything he's done for them and their joy that they're now dying and going to go and be with God, and they've had the honor of suffering for Jesus Christ while they're burning to death. And I take it that this is not just a denial that suffering is real or in some sense a bad thing, although that gets into some debates. Right? But the idea is that this greater good comes out of going through suffering, so it's something to be welcomed. Now, along these lines is the idea that the good life was available to everyone. I think this ties into the idea of personal responsibility. So a person could say, look, if I live the way I'm being told to live, I'm going to get found out, I'm going to be tortured, I'm going to be executed. And the answer is, yes, you can, but by being tortured and executed, you are going to unite yourself to Christ. You're going to become closer to Christ. You're going to be imitating him, and he's going to help you with this, right? And you're going to be expressing your love for Christ for this. So the good life is available to everyone, regardless of their material circumstances. One important idea in early Christianity is the idea of doctrine as a sacred task. Christians emphasized a responsibility to hold certain beliefs and pass them on to the next generation. The idea was that God had given Christians certain truths, certain things to believe about God, about the nature of Christ, the nature of the world, the nature of humans, etc. And their responsibility was to believe them and teach them to the next generation of people who converted or to their children. Now, we generally think of this as follows. Sometimes this definitely did mean that they disciplined or expelled people who did not hold certain beliefs. So what's often called the Catholic tradition held that Jesus Christ really did become a human being and he had a body. There was a group called Docetists, and they held that Jesus did not actually have a body. It was just an illusion of a body. And they were expelled from the community for that, for not holding the right beliefs. And that's when we hear terms like heresy, that's usually what we think of, people being criticized or disciplined or expelled from the community for holding the wrong beliefs. But it's important to remember that that's not always what it meant. Sometimes it meant that the community disciplined or expelled people who tried to push certain optional beliefs on everyone else. So I think of the Agonicites. The Agonicites insisted that Christians must never kneel when they pray. They could only stand. And as I understand it, they were told this is wrong. This is not the practice that everyone has to follow. You can't insist that this practice, which is, I assume they meant was optional, must be done by everyone else. Okay? So it's not always saying, when people make accusations of heresy, they're not always saying, you must believe like we do. Sometimes they're saying, no, this is an area where you can't expect everyone to believe the same thing, and you can't be part of the community if you're insisting everyone believe or do things your way. Now, let me say a note about gender. Early Christians affirmed the dignity of women, and at the same time, early Christians remained patriarchal. As far as I can tell, there's very little evidence of any widespread practice of ordaining women to the priesthood or as bishops. Right? There's a few references. It seems to have been criticized at some point, which indicates it was going on somewhere, but we have very little evidence of where and when it was actually happening. So the overwhelming norm was they only ordained men as priests or bishops. Now, people that adhere to Christianity in the contemporary world take this in a couple different ways. Some people will say these things can be reconciled. Okay, so the dignity and equality of human beings is compatible with a certain amount of hierarchy, including a gender hierarchy. Now, how far that's taken is a thing people discuss. Other people basically say, no, the essential point was the dignity of women. It's just they hadn't really worked out and understood the full implications of what that meant at that time, or they were just adapting to certain things about the local circumstance. And so it was a developing process that we're getting better at today. Right? I'm just going to leave that there. That's a point on which many people disagree. Now, this brings us around to the contrast between sin and vice. The concept of sin seems to involve a direct personal offense against God. Also, there's a strong view that everyone is morally responsible. And along with this, there is a preoccupation with struggling against temptation. Okay? So psychology or moral psychology gets sharply developed in Christian writings. And there's also an expectation that we will always sin to some extent, but at the same time, this is not seen as an excuse. The idea that even if your vices get smaller, you will always be fighting against your vices. You will always be having to ask forgiveness for something. So this pattern of recognizing that you've sinned, asking for forgiveness, and asking for help to change will continue until you die. And this is not seen as in any way an excuse for people's actions. And let me say something about the moral law. The New Testament does not lay out a detailed moral law distinct from religion. At the same time, there's a couple things to keep in mind. Paul does argue that people can know something about God and about ethics through reason. And divine commandments play some kind of role. The Old Testament still has some kind of role. What that is gets debated. And Jesus Christ directly gives commandments. So notice you have two elements here. A continuing role for law in some sense, right? And divine commandments being given to human beings. And of course, in the background, Paul seems to indicate that some things can be known about God and ethics through reason. Now, this is material that later figures we'll look at have to work with. How do we bring these different things together? And of course, in some ways, a lot of people will argue this is part of the origin of our concept of a distinct moral law, which can be known through reason. But that's a process we'll be talking about a lot in future weeks. So bear those points in mind. So the bottom line, Christianity brought a number of dramatic changes to the Greco-Roman world. This includes a strong belief in the dignity of each human being, regardless of class, and along with this belief comes a strong sense of individual responsibility. And that is going to be part of the material that influences later Western ethics. Thank you.